good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be in XRP Army Newsland. It is a sincere pleasure again to welcome um, Doctor, Professor, Law Professor.
I am those things, but you can just call me Bob, Brother Scott.
Okay. I'd like to introduce again to everyone my friend Bob Hockett, our Cornell professor, who is going to speak with us again about crypto, regulations, economics, the Fed, the Treasury, and how wonderful and beautiful the weather is in Ithaca, New York area today, as opposed to the rain and drizzle of the last 48 hours in the beautiful state of North Carolina. So, Bob, I'd like to welcome you again, my friend.
Thank you, Scott. Really, really a joy. Always fun. I love our off-camera chats, and I love our on-camera chats. I always seem to learn an awful lot from all of these, and it's just great fun to sort of, chew the fat with you and talk about these things together.
Yeah, it's been fascinating for me as well. And again, my mother being she has a PhD in English literature, and I grew up. She was a college professor my entire life, so it's always nice to speak to an academic person, faculty member somewhere, because it just I'm very familiar with that. So
Yeah.
I enjoy our conversations very much. So today I would like to kind of talk about crypto, and one of the things again that in our community, in the XRP community, we feel like that one of the things that is holding up mass adoption are the regulations that the Fed and the government are all going to put together. And since you are familiar and write articles and acts about that, that's one of the things that I'd like to. We spoke about that last week. That where do you feel like that we are along the road of adoption? And is the beer cold? And we call it that because if we call it the C word, then YouTube has a nice habit recently of taking video channels down that use that language. So I want to be careful about that particular language. But I just kind of want to, kind of touch base with you again and feel like, regulations. And one thing, I gave you a document that was created by a company called Everest. And didn't know if you had had a chance to look over that document, because to me it was interesting because it was written in 2017, and they put together a timeline that looks eerily similar, that they're hitting all of the targets on that timeline that they created in 2017. So I don't want to get too much into the tin hat. Somebody behind the behind the scene or scenes has all of this planned out and laid out, and it's working out exactly the way that it's supposed to. But again, the regulations are part of what we feel like in the XRP community is like the last leg that we're waiting on. And as soon as that happens, then good things will begin in our mass adoption of the world going digital.
Yeah. So I think my guess is that you and I see things kind of similarly here. My thought is that in general, regulating in this space ought to be done with a particular purpose in view. And if that particular purpose is kept in view, the regulatory burden will tend to be very light, if not even minimal or non-existent, on sort of small startups and people who are sort of just starting something new. And will fall primarily, or maybe even entirely, insofar as it falls at all, on very large institutions that would then have the capacity to abuse lots of innocent third parties, right? So this is the way it seems to me things ought to be, basically. When we're talking about innovations that both hold a lot of promise with respect to, at least to their sort of potential, on the one hand, and that don't pose any kind of threat to any sort of innocent third party, on the other hand, then it seems to me that this should be viewed as being, basically part of the realm of free contracting and free innovating and free developing and free sort of brainstorming and basically collaborative intellect, basically collaborative thinking and collaborative designing, because that's of course where a lot of the coolest stuff ultimately comes from, right? The miracle of the human mind and the miraculous sort of inventiveness and creativity of the human mind is just, it's something that, it's a wonderful and marvelous thing to behold when you get to see it. And one of the things that really tends to amplify it is precisely when people are able to sort of work together and collaborate on projects together. The old saying that two heads are better than one isn't just, the sort of the basis of that isn't just the two heads are like twice as good as one head. It's that the two heads become sort of more than the sum of their parts when they're joined together. There's something in the kind of interaction or in the symbiosis or the synergy that comes of sort of multiple creative minds interacting and creating and producing together. And that's something that I think we as a sort of entrepreneurial culture, and even as a sort of a culture more generally, have been very good at sort of fostering, facilitating, nurturing, and vindicating, right? And even allowing to profit in order then to sort of encourage yet more of it, or at least to avoid discouraging it. And when we've got our regulatory systems right, it seems to me we don't do anything to squelch that. All that we squelch is activities that can end up harming third parties who haven't consented to be affected. But that generally doesn't happen until something becomes big. If you become Amazon sized, then you sneeze and everybody catches a cold, right? You're basically like an elephant, and if you roll over, any mice or little dogs that happen to be sleeping near you get crushed. But we're talking, when we're talking about the XRP community, we're really not talking about elephants, right? We're talking, I think, about just brilliant, creative. What's our preferred breed of dog? Should we say terriers, maybe, because they're kind of scrappy. So we've got, if you think about the XRP community and other sort of similar communities, it seems to me that we're really talking about scrappy and energetic and lively terriers. And then when we talk about, something that gets really big, maybe bigger even than Bitcoin, like Facebook, for example, and Libra, there you're talking about an elephant or a whale. And so, sure, in a case like that, the possible third-party effects are considerable. And it makes sense then for that, entity that is acting in the name of us all, namely our federal government, to sort of act to prevent abuses or sort of unreasonable risks of that kind. But unfortunately, it seems to me that we kind of do the opposite very oftentimes in our culture. What we see, and I shouldn't say culture, but in our sort of legal system, and maybe more to the point in our sort of regulatory system, is it seems to me that we have a tendency sort of systematically to privilege and to encourage and even to give, in effect, rents to these really giant entities. We basically seem to favor them either deliberately or maybe unintendedly, consequentially, all too often. And so we end up, basically making it possible for a Facebook to become mega gigantic, even to the point where it can become abusive of its own power. All the while that we're sort of discouraging or, regulating virtually out of existence, again, the kind of the scrappy terriers. In other words, it's not only not the right system, but it's almost the precise opposite of what the right system should be. If you're not going to aid or sort of help out or nurture the smaller startups, then for God's sake, at least don't be aiding and nurturing the giant mega companies. But even better still, maybe keep an eye on those bigger companies, because they're the ones that could become dangerous or become sort of governments unto themselves. And that's not something that we want. That's sort of part of it. It wasn't just King George or Parliament that they were troubled about. They were also troubled by these big state monopolies that King George granted to certain gigantic, basically global companies that were founded in Britain, right? Like the East India Company, which is almost a country. It operated almost as though it were a nation state with its own armies and so forth. And this was all through various monopoly privileges that the government of Great Britain gave to them. And the colonists were kind of a bunch of startup type people, most of them, and they really didn't appreciate that kind of arrangement. And so it's a little disturbing, it seems to me, when we kind of replicate that now by basically helping out, JP Morgan Chase or Goldman Sachs or Facebook or whatever, while, kind of basically not only not helping the smaller companies, which are the real drivers of new things, but even acting in some ways to hinder them, oftentimes. Right. So I think,
Well,
yeah.
well, one thing that I was curious about is that I in your circles, are you finding that the idea of cryptocurrencies are the ones who are going to be putting these regulations into place?
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like that their level of understanding of it is growing? And one other thing before you touch on that, one of the reasons that my crypto experience is the very first thing that ever happened to me was I was on the internet maybe 6 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I ran across Bitcoin, and a guy named Brock Pierce was the guy that I started watching videos, and he was teaching me about it. And a guy named Don Tapscott was talking about blockchain, and I was fascinated. I mean, I could understand how what Don Tapscott was talking about was going to revolutionize everything. Then I didn't do anything as far as getting invested in Bitcoin at all until 2017. And then I took my first plunge when it got to 15,000.
Ah, right.
Then 3 months later, it got to 20, and then nose died down and blah, blah, blah. Now it's back up to over between 9 and 10,000 now. But in the meantime, I stumbled across Ripple and I stumbled across XRP. And the thing that has fascinated me the most about XRP and Ripple is that Ripple wanted to go directly to the regulators. They want, and they, the people who do not like Ripple and XRP don't like it because of that. They feel like they're selling out the anarchists, the Bitcoiners, the private coin people like Cardano and Monero who want privacy coins. They don't like Ripple and XRP because they feel like they sold out to the man. They're the banker's coin.
Yeah.
And the amount of infiltration that it seems like that Ripple has made with knowing these regulatory people and being involved with them. But I just wanted to be able to kind of hear from you from the insider's view, because Ripple started out as a startup in San Francisco in 2012. And today they've got contracts with, I believe, over 300 banks and a great partnership with MoneyGram, where their solution for cross-border remittance is working. Their use case is working. That what they're doing with MoneyGram is saving the people sending the money from America to Mexico and Mexico to America, and it's saving MoneyGram money. But again, I'm not too sure if you have a feel for the level of understanding for what Ripple has done. And I don't know if you were aware of it, Bob, but they today have a valuation of over $10 billion. I mean, that what they've done from startup in 2012 to where they are today is substantial.
Oh yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's only it's not really been that long, right? I mean, years is a fairly brief span in which to grow from zero to multi-billions, right? I mean, that says a lot. I think maybe a couple things maybe to say. So you opened by asking, or you began this question by asking, what do I think the sort of the general level of knowledge or the knowledge base is among the regulators and the policymakers here, and does it seem to be improving and the like? And I think that the short answer is yes, it is improving and growing. The slightly longer answer is that it started from a pretty low point, and so it's there's still, I think, most legislators and most staffers, it's probably fair to say, are still kind of playing catch up. They're very smart and able people on both sides of the aisle. I've met an awful lot of really impressive, intellectually impressive Democrats and Republicans in the Congress, both the House side and the Senate side. And I've met especially an awful lot of really scary smart aides, right? The various staffers for many of these members of Congress, again, on both sides of the aisle and in both chambers. And so even the ones who are starting from pretty far back and are still kind of catching up are catching up rapidly because they're very able, quick studies, but it is still going to take, I think, more time before they're all sort of fully on board and sort of fully knowledgeable. And as far as the Congress members themselves are concerned, of course, it takes them even longer in many cases because many of them are not quite as maybe young and as eager to learn new things. It's I don't want to stereotype because there are lots of people who are in their 70s and 80s who are smart as whips and always eager to learn new things. So I don't want to sort of paint with too broad a brush, but it probably is the case as a general matter. On average, the younger you are or the newer you are to something, the more eager you are to learn more, and the less sort of reluctant you are to sort of admit that you don't yet know everything that needs to be known. So there's a kind of an intellectual humility of a kind, at least when it comes to learning, that you find oftentimes on average among younger folk, and that's notwithstanding the fact that some younger folk already think they know everything, which can be another problem. But in any event, right? But as a general matter, I think that lots of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and again in both chambers, and their staffers are catching up. They're getting there. Similarly with the regulators, they're catching up and getting there too. And you see a kind of a growing number of staffers who have some knowledge of or are cognizance or conversance with the tech space or the fintech space in the various regulatory agencies and entities. I mean, a great example might be the IMF, for example, where, I used to work before I became a law prof, and then where I went back to work for a year when I had my first sabbatical back in, this would have been 2012, 2013. This was both my first sabbatical and the last one I had because I haven't taken one since. I'm just too excited about, I guess, what I'm doing at the school. But in any event, when I was back there for 2012, 2013, I mean, there was nobody who was doing crypto type stuff or fintech type stuff. I mean, or if there was, it certainly was it was certainly under the surface of things in such a way that, we didn't know of it. We didn't know that anybody there was working on such things. But then, I'd say, by maybe I want to say by spring, maybe of 2013, this would have been maybe March or April. I remember I went to a bankers conference over actually near your neck of the woods. I went to Charlotte to an APA meeting there. And I was sort of pleasantly surprised by the number of folk there who were at least aware of development, that there was a thing, so to speak, in the crypto space, and that things were sort of beginning to happen. And this included not just people who were working for banking corporations like Bank of America or what have you, but even some Treasury officials I sort of rubbed elbows with over there, who I was talking with at that conference, were at least sort of aware, and they were sort of beginning to talk about it. And then I'd say within about another year, probably by 14 or 15, I started to get notes from various friends and former colleagues, both at the IMF and at the Fed, and then at some of the other central banks in other parts of the world, including the Bank of England, from old friends who were working at these places saying that they were working on fintech type stuff now. So that would have been 5-6 years ago. And so, they began to kind of move they began to sort of respond, I guess you could say, to developments fairly early on. I mean, they could have, I suppose ideally people at the central banks and the regulatory agencies would have been on this by 2011 at latest or so, but starting in 2013, not too late. But again, it takes a little while, I think, for this to sort of burgeon in the same degree or at the same rate that it's burgeoning in the industry, partly because the budgets that have to be spent out of to hire new people with expertise at these agencies tend to be fairly limited. I think it's a lot quicker and easier for a big bank to tool up by just hiring a whole bunch of fintech people, all this, virtually overnight when they realize that they need it, than it is for a regulatory agency to do that because of all the usual constraints on hiring and so forth in federal agencies. So there's a sense in which I think the regulators and the public entities are still a little bit behind the private sector thanks to those budget constraints, but they're getting there. And so I'm sort of optimistic that in the medium term they're going to get this right. But I also worried that until we get there, in the kind of short term, before we get to the medium term, there might be a tendency either to okay too many things or just to say no to too many things, just because if you don't have enough manpower or brain power present to kind of arrive at well-informed decisions, you might sort of just adopt a kind of a heuristic, as they call it, where you just say, well, let's just generally be negative, or let's just generally say anything goes. And those are the two extreme forms of unthinking response, you might say. And either one of those, it seems to me, is basically, beckoning trouble.
Well, one of the if I get the name wrong, then my XRP community members are going to kill me. But I think it was Evan Schwartz was at a conference a couple of years ago, and someone asked him, well, and I'm leading somewhere with this. He said, would you basically say, how much of the piece of the pie are you talking about with Ripple and XRP? And his famous quote was, he kind of, startled in his own mind. You could see the wheels turning, and he kind of chuckled, Bob, and he said, all of the money. And the reason that he was saying that, and it's part of the way that the XRP people feel about it, the way we understand it, is that part of what David Schwartz and Chris Larson created was the ILP, the interoperable ledger.
Yeah.
And if they get, and then they gifted that, and I believe, if I get the name wrong again, I apologize, but I think that it was something called the World Wide Web Consortium.
Yeah.
Now, I could be wrong on that, but
yeah.
So XRP, I mean, basically Ripple with the interoperable ledger protocol, if they have given that as the plumbing of the new financial system, and they gifted it. That is not something that they own anymore. They gave it to the World Wide Web Consortium. And and again, the reasoning is because the problem that I saw when I first saw, I always like to try to figure out what is it, the problem that a company is trying to solve. If they can solve the problem effectively, then that's a winner.
Yeah.
So the problem is that we've got a 40-year-old technology with Swift. It is slow. It has a 3 to 4 day settlement period, which creates the banks having to have nostro vostro money tied up. It has a 6% error rate. And so it's kind of like when the new technology comes along, and I realize that everybody is on a cassette, but when the new technology is there and everybody sees a CD, I mean, the money that is being transferred now and utilizing XRP as the bridge currency, right? But just the technology of that, it just seems like that's not that hard of a thing to figure out. I mean, we've got an existing technology. It's a donkey. It's slow. It's inefficient. And it's expensive. And we have a new technology. And that's where I see Ripple, basically, Bob, as being kind of separate and different than the other cryptocurrency projects out there, because like for instance, Bitcoin, I own a tiny amount of Bitcoin, and I don't have any problem if it goes to $100,000 for Bitcoin, none at all. I'm not a XRP maximalist. I'm just trying to look at it practically for what kind of use it could have. Practical use. Now, as a store of value like gold or silver, I see that it could have a great store of value, but nobody can use it for anything because if you wanted to use it for anything, it's very costly and it's very slow. And again, when I look at the use case of Swift as opposed to what the interoperable ledger as the plumbing of the economic system goes, I think that there could be an adoption of where people and regulators and educators like what Ripple is doing, but not necessarily the use of XRP in the new plumbing system. Although RippleNet, the software that Ripple contracts with banks, their clients to use, does work best with their token XRP. But I didn't know if that was something that, if your understanding of Ripple and the interledger protocol, if you understood that's what they were trying to do, to be the new plumbing of the entire internet. Because as you know, when Al Gore
back when he invented it,
it was just a couple of college professors emailing back and forth together. There was no cryptography. That they didn't know that it needed to be secure. Well, then it just spread from there and opened us up for companies like Norton and like McAfee to come along to build something on top of the layer of the foundation of the protocol because it wasn't secure. Well, now replacing that, and that's kind of, again, going back to my roots of understanding blockchain from Don Tapscott, that we need to have a new protocol for the internet that is more secure. And it looks to me like the interoperable ledger protocol that David Schwartz created, and then Ripple gave it to the World Wide Web Consortium fits that. So do you feel like that there's any kind of knowledge and understanding with the powers that be that kind of thing is going on?
I think there is, Scott. I think there's awareness that kind of thing is going on. And I think there's also awareness that XRP, or that Ripple and XRP more generally, are sort of on the minds of those folk. On the other hand, I think that the sort of the posture that most of the policymakers and regulators are taking right now is similar to that's being taken by a lot of other people, which is that you know, the typical person, including myself, might look out there, and there seems to be a lot of ferment going on, right? There's a lot of stuff being thought up, a lot of things being sort of tried, a lot of things being invented and then experimented with. And it doesn't look as though the period of experimentation or sort of fermentation is going to end anytime real soon. In other words, it doesn't look like we're sort of all converging now on one single protocol that will all be sort of agreed as the right one by this December or something like that. And this leads, I think, to either of two possibilities. And I'm going to hope that it's one and not the other. So one of the possibilities is that people just throw their hands in the air and say, I can't decide. I just don't know. And so they just wait forever, and they wait so close to literally forever that nothing ever ends up happening. That's one possibility, of course. And that's, it can certainly look to the untrained eye as though that's the possibility that we're living right now. But the other possibility is this, that you basically realize two things. A, that yes, there is still development going on and experimentation going on, such that it would be premature to sort of foreclose any further experimentation by simply settling on something right now, while at the same time recognizing that at some point a decision does have to be made. At some point, you're probably deciding between 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And at that point, you just have to sort of settle on something, right? I sometimes draw the analogy to the sort of what's going on here, although this is not a really good analogy in some ways, because what's going on here is so much more complex. But there's at least a rough analogy, I think, that could be drawn between what's going on here right now and what was going on in video technology, let's say 40 or 50 years ago.
Yep.
So, there was VHS versus Betamax, and there were various other possibilities as well. And eventually we sort of settled. It became pretty clear that it was probably going to be VHS or Betamax. Like one of those two was those two were clearly dominant relative to all competitors. But then when you got right down to those two, it seems to me, I wasn't conscious really of these at the time. I was too young, but from what I've read at some, and say with you, of course, Scott, I mean, but you've probably read about this since then, that, at some point they just decided that we'll just settle on this, right?
Right.
Another analogy, I suppose, could be between AC and DC, right? I mean, basically,
Right.
Nikola Tesla had one particular form of electricity that he thought would be better. And then Edison had another form. Many people to this day think that Tesla's system would have been better. But Edison, for various reasons, ended up winning out. And so we have AC outlets in our homes, not DC outlets. Probably what happens is when you get down to two like that both have their own advantages and disadvantages, a wise, sort of decider says, okay, well, what's less important than which of these two we choose right now is just that we choose at least something. Just like we could choose to drive on the right side of the road or on the left side of the road, but you got to decide one or the other. You can't do both. So I think that we probably aren't yet at the point where it's down to two or three candidates alone that we now have to flip a coin among. We might still be at the stage where there are 5 to 10 that are plausible, and so we have to wait a little longer to see how things develop to sort of figure out what seems likely to win. But as long as people who do the standard setting, including regulators, understand that we do want to get to that point and not have to wait for a half a century to get there, then I think we're all right? Because then I think we draw a reasonable balance between allowing continued optimization on the one hand and arriving at a decision to where we can actually start doing things on the other hand, right? Rather than just waiting forever and never making a decision.
Well, and I appreciate that. And one thing that I wanted to mention too, you sparked in my mind when you were talking about Bernanke in his interview with 60 Minutes years ago. I stumbled across a documentary. I don't know if you've ever seen it before. It was called The Warning. Have you ever seen that, Bob?
Yeah, it's funny, Scott. I remember that name, and I'm just not remembering now whether I watched it. I probably saw it on YouTube or something, and I don't remember now whether I actually viewed it.
It was the story of a woman called Brooksley Born.
Oh,
does that
right.
ring a bell?
CFTC chair. Yeah.
Fascinating.
First woman ever to be the president of a major university law review.
Absolutely.
Woman.
The woman should have a bronze statue somewhere.
Fully
agree. What a woman. I mean, she Stanford Law graduate. She got a lot of grief in her law school because she was a woman in late 60s, and the men in her class resented her because she was taking away a spot from a guy that wouldn't have to go to war if he was in that spot. And then she was hired to look out after trouble with the derivative market.
Yep.
She saw it. She went to Rubin and Larry Summers and the Greenspan, and they fired her.
Yep. They said, "Don't worry your pretty little head over it, little lady."
That's
classic. The towel the locker room towel snapper type guys, right? The kind of jock, Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, she was.
2 weeks later, Bob, Bear Stearns went belly up.
And then there it went. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. At the time, back when Bear Stearns went belly up, I was a freshly minted, basically law professor. I was pretty new still, and I had this sort of line with my students. I was telling them back from 2008 through 2010 or 11 that if you actually looked at the performance of the various financial regulators that we had during the Clinton years and then the early Bush years, that uniformly the most sort of prophetic, foresighted of all of them were women. And the male regulators, who all seemed to be sort of testosterone poisoned, had really screwed it up. So Brooksley Born was one of the heroes of this country as chair of the CFTC. Sheila Bair was another hero at the head of the FDIC. She was appointed by Bush, was a Republican, but one of those kind of classic Kansas Republicans, the Alf Landon style Republicans, meaning basically common sense Republicans. And so she had been fantastic. And then trying to think of who else had done really well. I think that I'm probably forgetting one or two. At that time, Christine Lagarde had been a finance minister in France. This is before she went to the IMF, and she had done a superb job as finance minister of France. Maybe not quite as great a job at the IMF, but still not bad there either. But anyway, what was sort of interesting is that all these women in high positions seem to be less sort of taken with the kind of culture, the sort of daredevil risk-taking culture of Wall Street, and more concerned with keeping these markets, kind of reasonably operating. And so, of course, they were ignored by the Clinton people who were at the top. And then, of course, similarly ignored by the Bush people at the top. And then, ironically, also then kind of ignored by the Obama people. You might remember that when Obama won in November of 2008, there was a live question as to who he would choose for Secretary of the Treasury. And it came down to a choice between two people, Tim Geithner, then president of the New York Fed, and Sheila Bair, then head of the FDIC. And many people favored Sheila Bair, even though she was the Republican and Obama was a Democrat, and Geithner was apparently a Democrat. But, they ended up choosing Geithner because, as in his words, Sheila wasn't a team player, which basically just means she didn't agree with Larry Summers and Bob Rubin, and then the other sort of towel snappers who came after them during the Bush years, right? O'Neill. So, I think, I used to joke with my students for a while. I used to say, basically, I wouldn't have to teach this course if we just put women in charge of these agencies because finance would be boring and functional instead of exciting and destructive, like fast cars,
That's one of the paradigm shifts. I agree with you, Bob, that maybe we ought to try in humanity. So let's let the women make the decisions, and then we just carry out with our testosterone. We'll carry out what they think's best. Because the way we're doing it, it just seems like we're in a big mess. Now, one of the things too that I'm very curious to be able to understand from your viewpoint, because I'm again a layman. I do have a college degree. I mentioned it to you last week, but it's in radio and TV communications. It's not in economics. But the last 2 years since I've been really throwing myself heavily into crypto, I've spent unbelievable amounts of time, not just on crypto videos, but on trying to understand, economics and Peter Schiff. And one of my favorites, I don't know if you've ever heard this guy yet. If you ever get a chance, listen to some of his videos. He's absolutely brilliant. And he gets such joy out of the presentation of his material. You'll see that if you ever watch any of his videos. His name is George Gammon.
Okay, I'll look for this. Yeah.
The joy that he feels when he is sharing information is just very infectious.
It's a lovely thing, isn't it?
I've interviewed George. He's just a great guy. So, but the point that I'm trying to get at, Bob, is that I feel like that the system is irrevocably flawed. And all we did in 2008-9 is we put a Band-Aid on it and we kicked the can down the road. And I believe that we have got to have a fundamental change. I feel like that, and better than I do, that in human history, we've had a currency that has run in humanity for a period of time, and then it had to stop, and we went in a different direction. And I don't know if you feel, I personally, from my layman's point of view, my everyman, just every man in, average guy on the street looking at this now, that it appears to me that the fiat experiment, where when we went off the gold standard and we began to allow these central banks to leverage the assets to loan, they got $1 and they can loan 10, and then they're rehypothecating all of those investments together. Then they're putting them in derivative packages, combining them all together where they don't even know what they mean, but they're selling them to somebody at the end of the road. And then if we look at our pensions, I know that the state pension system in Illinois, I heard is in really bad shape. And I think that there are other pensions in other areas that are in bad shape. And it just seems to me, not being an economics person, but when I've looked at all of this stuff, Bob, it looks to me like it's just a house of cards. And eventually we've got to bite the bullet. And I don't know if we talked about a debt jubilee last week. But that's something, again, that I've heard in the circles that I listen to, that it's gotten to the point where we need a new system. And I don't know if that's going to be something digital. I think that we are going personally to a digital and a cashless society. That I think that's what it looks like to me. But I just don't see how we're $147 trillion in unfunded liabilities. I don't see how any of the people with all of these economic degrees and have been the experts in these areas are looking at this and realizing, hey, you know what? This is really, really, really broken, and it just is not going to work. We've got to go in a different direction. We cannot afford to kick this down the road, the can down the road anymore. I mean, $147 trillion in debt. What are we going to do?
Yes.
So that's a mouthful, huh?
So I think, there, and there's a lot to be said about each sort of individual element. So I'll do the best I can to say at least what I can about a few of these things that I feel at least some knowledge about. So first of all, just to start with the easiest thing, the matter of a jubilee, I think that there's a very important reason that has been a kind of fundamental institution of human history since biblical times. I think there's an understanding, a deep wisdom in our sort of collective human memory that we have, to the effect that, we have tendencies to do certain things to excess when we don't control ourselves. And that sometimes we get ourselves in so bad that the only way to get out is basically just to forgive some stuff. In a certain sense, you could say that the crucifixion of Christ was the ultimate jubilee, right? I mean, it was itself a kind of jubilee. Like, okay, look, it's basically God saying, you humans have screwed up so badly that you're beyond your own redemption, and you can only be redeemed through divine grace. And you could almost view this itself as a kind of jubilee. And before that, of course, the more kind of workaday jubilee was the institution of every 7 years, sort of canceling out debts. I think something like that is probably all in. Actually, one more point is that bankruptcy law is in its own right a kind of legal attempt to do something jubilee-like. The real key, I think, to getting jubilees right is to make them somewhat unpredictable. Because, of course, if they're completely predictable, like it's every 7 years on June 1st, or people arbitrage around it, and then it's no good. So you need a certain random element. And in a way, that's sort of what the Protestant doctrine of divine grace is all about too. Like that, it was just random, right? Who could have predicted that God was just going to forgive everybody, and it's not like it was done pursuant to a schedule or something. He just did it, right? And in a way that captures this idea that it has to be stochastic, to use financial lingo. It has to be unpredictable. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I think we're always going to have something kind of like that. Moving then on to the way the system works when it comes to the sort of proliferation of debt and the circulation of debt and the seemingly unlimited rehypothecation that can be done in various forms of contracting, including repo contracts. I think that there's a fundamental problem that in a certain sense underlies most of these other problems, which are also deep. But what I'm saying is I think there might be one ultra deep problem that is the source of these other deep problems. And it's basically this. Any society that has an exchange economy where we basically buy and sell from each other rather than having everything sort of distributed by a government like a big brother or by the GUM department store in the Soviet Union or something. Anytime you have an exchange economy where productive activity then is also done through essentially free assembling of groups, is faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, it needs a uniform currency that's the same throughout the economy in order to operate at all. But then as soon as that you have a problem. You need, on the one hand, some entity, some way of ensuring that the supply of the currency is in sync with the supply of goods and services that are being produced. So you need the money supply to kind of grow gradually with wealth itself, but you can't allow the money supply to grow faster than wealth itself because then it inflates. And you also can't let it grow slower than potential wealth growth itself because then you have deflation. You basically have an artificial sort of slowing down or prevention of growth. So we're always sort of looking for that Aristotelian golden mean between inflation and deflation, or it could also be thought of as like the Goldilocks principle. You need just the right amount of money. Now, in theory, that could be doable, but here's where the real problem comes in, or here's what makes it, I think, especially difficult, is let's call that task. Let's call a task of keeping the money supply just right, so it grows gradually with wealth or with potential wealth. Let's call that the modulation function, where you're modulating the currency. That's the term that doctors use when they talk about modulating the drug that you take for some disease or whatever. So you've got, on the one hand, a modulatory task, and because that's an aggregate, the sort of monetary aggregate is an aggregate, meaning that it's sort of the whole macro economy. You need some entity that has a kind of a view of the entire economy to have some sort of role in determining what that aggregate amount of money is, because you basically are balancing the total money supply against the total economy. So that modulatory task requires some kind of a centralized or sort of upper level bird's eye view. But now here's where the problem comes in. There's another task that we're faced with when it comes to that monetary aggregate, and that is not just the modulation of it, but what I call the allocation of it. Where does it go, in other words, right? And we have, I think, wisely, as a society, decided that in an exchange economy like our own, private sector financial institutions have to play some role in doing that allocating, right? So basically, private sector banks are supposed to be on the lookout for what look to be, really good, prospects or opportunities. Like Ripple comes along or some new company comes along. The hope is that private sector banks are pretty good at figuring out what projects are likely to succeed and which projects are not likely to succeed. And so the hope is then, with that knowledge, they will allocate the credit money, as they call it, in smart ways that basically fuel the kind of carrying on of the project that the smart people have an idea to do, but not let the money flow toward the sort of the dumb projects, right? But but that becomes the source of a problem, because if the private sector institutions are doing the allocating, but a public sector institution is doing the modulating, what's going to be the relation between the two, right? Because you can't modulate adequately if you're not allocating smartly, but but you also can't allocate wisely if you're not modulating wisely. So it all right. What's the proper relation between the private?
So let me see if I'm keeping up. That's where the regulations come in.
Bingo. Yeah, and we're getting them right. See, and that's why getting the regs right is really existentially important. It's not just a matter of, oh, did somebody's freedoms get trampled on, or did somebody not get allowed to do? Was somebody not allowed to do what they wanted to do? I mean, that's important stuff. But in a way, it's even more important. At least if we're talking, there's an even more important stake here if we're talking about the economy, and that is that if we don't get those regs right, then we don't get the public-private balance right, and that means we don't get the modulation and the allocation tasks properly synced up. And the result of not getting those properly synced up is one of two: lose value, and then there's a crash, or you have insufficient, overly small, overly low money supply, so that there's not enough development financing for the startups. And so
Got it.
you can end up starving the startups if you don't have enough money out there, but you can also end up flooding. An analogy I find useful, you and I are probably old enough, Scott, to remember a time when there were automobiles that had engines that had carburetors. Remember the
Yes.
carburetor? And
Oh,
now,
yeah.
right now, virtually everything seems to be fuel injected, right?
Right.
But you remember that the thing about the carburetor was it could be a beautiful thing if everything, if you didn't flood it, if you didn't push down at the wrong time on the pedal, then man,
Yeah.
that 455 cc, yeah, but your Chevelle Malibu with a 455 cc V8 in it, if you did it just right, boy, that thing would roar and you'd fly. But on the other hand, if you press down the accelerator too quickly when you were starting it up, you might flood the engine, right? And if we liken the money supply to the gasoline, then you could sort of say that our current system of money modulation and allocation is kind of like a carburetor rather than a fuel injector. And that means it can be really great, but it can also be really screwy. And we can flood the engine, which is, of course, the inflation problem, or we can not give enough fuel when it's needed and the engine might die just because it's just not getting the adequate fuel. So in a sense, what we really need, I think, is a monetary system that is sort of more like a fuel injection system than like a carburetor, right? Where things are a little bit better targeted. It's sort of going back to that gun analogy too. Like you can get away with just a pellet gun if you aim it properly, but if you can't aim, then you're going to need the AR-15 because then at least one of those bullets might hit what you're trying to get. But
Right.
you end up destroying a lot of other stuff too. So if we can basically move from a carburetor financial system to a fuel injection financial system, we'll be golden. But that, of course, is the 64, I guess let's call it the $64 trillion question instead of that. How do we do that? Now, as you know, I'm sort of ridiculously optimistic. I just have this kind of great belief in the human capacity to kind of invent and create and get better with time.
Me too.
And you too, I can tell, right? We both have that same spirit. And I think that the new financial technologies offer the potential of a kind of fuel injected style of money system. But so in that sense, I think we know what direction to look in now. But that being said, I think we still don't know exactly what we're going to do, even though we're looking in the right direction. And that's what we still have yet to do, I think. Now, most of my work as an academic and as a sort of a thinker about these things, as an author as well, I guess you could say, is basically devoted to that task. You could kind of say that what I'm basically all about is trying to figure out what a nice fuel injection financial system is going to look like. I can tell you, I can point to everything in the world that makes the current system like a carburetor system, which means it's a vulnerable system. But I'm still working out, as are you, and I suspect lots of other people, how precisely to construct the fuel injection alternative. I think we know what some pieces of it are going to look like. I think we probably have a pretty good idea, both you and I, of what some aspects of it are going to look like. But there's some other aspects that I think my guess is that we're both still trying to figure out, and maybe because everybody else is still trying to figure this out too. But that's probably a not altogether inaccurate metaphor for sort of what the task is at this point. And if that's right, then we're a lot farther along now than we were 10 years ago, because 10 years ago, hardly anybody was even thinking about what a fuel-injected financial system might look like. At least now we're sort of thinking along those lines, it seems to me. Whether we think of it in those terms or not, it seems to me that functionally speaking, we're sort of thinking along those lines. And, as being the creative creatures that we are, if we're thinking along the right lines, then it's virtually inevitable that we're going to find the answer at some point here. And I don't think we're that far away from it, to tell you the truth. I think we're closing in.
Well, I hope so. And again, I really like simple.
Yeah, me too.
And again, when I just look at it like, I don't know, if I had the chance to sit down with, I don't know who it would be, Mr. Mnuchin. I don't know who it would be, but I would sit down because I believe in what Ripple has put forth.
Yeah.
And I would say, look, Steve, we've got swift, slow, inefficient, nostro vostro accounts needed because it's slow on the settlement time. We can solve this problem by settlement in 3 or 4 seconds
Mm-hmm.
and 0.00001 cost
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to what Swift is charging for their transfer fees
Mm-hmm.
now.
Mm-hmm.
And then and then the tech has to do, I think, with the phones. I don't know if I can get my phone. Oh, there we go.
Uh-huh.
The phones, right? Where, okay, now we've got the plumbing and the transfer and the settlement with a CD type technology moved away from the cassette.
Mm-hmm.
So we've upgraded the technology. And then the other thing that does, Bob, is that gives us the opportunity when we make everything mostly digital and mobile,
Mm-hmm.
is that now we can bring the unbanked and the underbanked into the game plan
Amen,
because
brother. Yeah.
on the phone
Yeah.
without
Completely.
having to have a bank account now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, as you know, that's sort of what I've been pushing, especially lately. Now that we have this kind of call from Congress to sort of come up with a better payment system, if for no other reason than to get relief money flowing efficiently. But I think that's exactly right. As I think we talked about this a little bit last time, that the really cool thing about some kind of digital system here in this context is that this is one of those cases where the thing that is fairer is also more efficient and more growth friendly, right? I mean, if you think about it, if people are excluded from the payment system, that means that they're excluded from transacting. And that has at least two significances, right? One is the justice significance. If people are excluded from the ability to transact, it's just not just or fair. It's not treating our fellow citizens as our sisters and brothers who have every right to be part of the same economy as we are. So there's the fairness part here, but then there's also the fact that it's basically we're throwing away potential growth because as you know, we measure the size of our economy by a measure called GDP. And GDP is basically just a measure of transaction volume. So if you're preventing transacting by some people, then you're preventing some transactions. And that means you're basically not maximizing transaction volume, i.e. GDP. So you could really grow GDP and hence the size of our economy and hence the wealth that is accumulated on an annual basis if you bring more people into the system of transacting, known as the payment system. And as you know, right, if Swift is slow, that also, of course, then is a drag on transaction volume, because volume here is a function of speed as well, right? Basically, more transacting within a given interval is a function of greater transaction speed within that interval. So if we can speed up transacting, if we can get transaction accounts to everybody in the form of wallets that they can have on their phones, or their phones or other smart devices, we're basically going to have a huge growth gain in addition to a huge justice gain. And how often does that happen? Very often, as you know, like some policy matter is argued over by two sides. The Democrats might be really gung-ho about the justice bit, but not really paying attention to the efficiency or growth bit. The Republicans might be gung-ho about, the growth bit or the efficiency bit, but maybe paying short shrift to the justice bit. Here's a case where everybody can agree it's a good thing, because if it's just and if there's not even a trade-off. In other words, you don't choose between we're willing to sacrifice some equality for some growth, or vice versa. Here you get the equality and the growth, in the same package. So I'm completely with you on that. It's why I've been really hammering away at this idea of a digital dollar and digital wallets that everybody would have. Couldn't agree more. And I think that could be part of that fuel injection system, by the way. That's part of fuel injecting, it seems to me.
So one thing that I'm curious about as well, one of the areas that we in our Ripple and XRP world feel like that a lot of the development and a lot of the agreements and a lot of the movement seem to be coming from is Japan.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you are very familiar with a bank consortium over there called SBI.
Yeah, I've heard of them. Yeah.
Well, they are very interesting they're involved with a corporation called NTT Data, who is conveniently owned in part by the Japanese government. And NTT Data also has got partnerships with NY Bank of Mellon. So all of these interconnected, you know, and it seems like that they have a big push that they want to push the development of what Ripple is trying to do and XRP. And it seems like that I just didn't know if in your circles that though what's going on in these other countries comes up very often.
Yeah, good question. So yes and no. I mean, not enough. I don't think I don't think that those in my circle are yet fully adequately aware of what's happening in some other jurisdictions. There's at least some awareness, and some people have more awareness of, say, what's happening in one place than in other places, and then somebody else might, have a great deal of expertise in what's happening in yet another place, but not the other places. And maybe then collectively, those in my circle have a great deal of knowledge about what's happening elsewhere, but there doesn't seem to be any forum within which we all share all of that knowledge, so that then we form a kind of common mind that has a comprehensive view of everything that's going on elsewhere. There's, most people I'm in regular contact with at least have a kind of passing awareness of what's happening in Canada, and then maybe to some extent in China and or Japan. And actually, surprisingly, not much more than that. I try to follow that stuff, but I also am always curious about a couple of other things. One is like what's happening in the Nordic countries at the moment, because they're often kind of ahead of everybody else on matters monetary. Yeah, on tech and on monetary matters. I mean, they were ahead of all of us on central banking way, centuries ago. And they were ahead of us when it came to developing paper currency instead of using metal. So you could almost say that the cutting edge of the Western world still seems to be, at least where matters monetary are concerned, seems still to be basically in Scandinavia. And with tech, it's kind of similar. I mean, they don't have a unique lead there, but on some things they often seem to be ahead. So I tend to keep up with what's going on there, kind of what is happening in some of the so-called lesser developed countries in Africa, and Central and South America, for a couple of reasons. One is I'm concerned, of course, with the plight of people in underdeveloped countries because they have much harder lives than we have. But another reason is that they often, because of their circumstances, are sort of forced to invent in ways that don't take a whole lot of money to sort of realize, to make happen. And oftentimes that gives you really good clues as to what our own startups might want to think about doing. So you probably know all about M-Pesa, for example, over in Ethiopia, and some of the kind of counterpart digital currency plans or sort of arrangements that have been developed in South American countries in particular. And there are abuses. There are some problems with M-Pesa, of course, that have gotten attention. But the bigger picture story is quite intriguing, because basically they're just leapfrogging without ever going through a sort of brick and mortar stage of banking. They're just going straight from no banks to digital wallet banks, which is kind of cool. And so in some ways, they're ahead of us on those things, simply because they don't have the luxury of waiting, because they don't already have the brick and mortar banks that we have. And this is, by the way, sort of a common sort of a motif. This is a sort of a recurring pattern in economic history more generally, that the way things sort of proceed is like some countries get ahead, and then other countries, instead of replicating what they do, just leapfrog over them because they can't afford to do what the ones ahead are doing. And so they come up with something cooler. And so that's part of why a country that's on top for some period of time might, 2 or 3 centuries later, not be on top anymore because of that kind of leapfrog effect. So in any event, I always find it really interesting then to see what they're developing in the lesser developed countries in the realm of fintech and banking, if for no other reason than even just to sort of get ideas as to how we might do things better here without having to wait for Bank of America to do it, or some big regulator, in bed with them.
Well, one of the things too that I was kind of curious about, if any of the people you included and in your circle have any feeling at all, pro or con, about Bitcoin. And the reason that I wanted to bring that up, it's the most well-known cryptocurrency out there. But one of the problems is right now that I think it's 52% of the mining is controlled in China.
Right.
That doesn't seem to me that the U.S. government would like China coin to have a substantial stake in the world economy.
No, you're I mean, just absolutely delightfully understated as ever. There's a nice there's a subtlety in your remarks that always just I love. So yes, you know, this probably won't surprise you, but it's sort of interesting and kind of heartening, I think. But so I talked to pretty regularly to quite a few Congress members on these matters, again, on both sides of the aisle. And interestingly, many Republicans are very interested in this, just like many Democrats are. And I think they're all interested for essentially the same reasons. But what kind of differs between them is that some of them are especially interested for reason A, and somewhat interested for reason B, and then others will be especially interested for reason B, and only somewhat interested for reason A. So if we call China reason B, then I think it's fair to say that the Republicans are especially interested in reason B in this case, right? So, you know, I regularly point out in these conversations that the Chinese are way ahead of us on a lot of things in this space, and that if they're increasingly positioning themselves to be able to kind of call the shots where global standards in innovation and further development is concerned. And that could end up being a real game-changing situation if we let it continue unchallenged. And I that right, and then the location of lots of Bitcoin infrastructure in China is a piece of this, right? There's a lot more there's a lot more that's ominous in this space that's going on in China right now. But the role of China in the life of Bitcoin is certainly one of those things, right? I think you're right. I don't think that Republican legislators, especially, but also I don't think Democrat legislators are going to be, you know, particularly excited by the thought of, you know, having China calling the crypto shots.
And you know, Bob, I don't think I'm not an XRP maximalist. I'm not. That's not how I'm wired. I mean, I would just as soon Bitcoin go to $100,000 or $1 million, like John McAfee said that it would do. I don't have any problem with that at all. But if China has positioned themselves to where they own 52% of the hash rate, I'm sorry, but as an American, that changes the deal for me.
Me too.
I feel very compassionate for the Winklevoss twins because I understand what happened with Mr. Zuckerberg. They ended up ending up on the short end of the stick. I know that they ended up getting a settlement, great. And I know that they're hugely Bitcoin maximalists, and of no fault of their own, China controlling 52% of the hash rate puts a damper on the old China coin. Sorry. And again, I'm not saying that, Bob, as a person that hates Bitcoin in any way. I don't. I could care less. I mean, I feel like that the problem that we've got is the fiat system and the central bankers. That's what I personally feel, the greed of the central bankers. That's what I feel like is the problem, not Bitcoin or Litecoin or Monero or Cardano, any of the other. I feel like all of these are part of possibly the solution. But again, now, and then I wanted to mention one other thing. I didn't know if you were aware of it or not, but did you see who sold 40 Bitcoin today?
No, I've actually been on the phone all day, so I'm not caught up. What happened today?
Guess who sold 40 Bitcoin today?
Would it be?
Starts with an S and the last name ends with an N. And we haven't heard from this guy in a while.
Oh, SN.
Satoshi Nakamoto.
Oh, are you kidding me? He himself?
Nope.
Oh my lordy, that is big news. I
Yeah.
wouldn't dare think that. It's almost like you just told me. Have you heard who wrote an 11th commandment today? His name is Moses.
So it was all over. It was all over Twitter today, Bob, that Satoshi Nakamoto bought 40 Bitcoin from an unknown wallet, a wallet that has not been used since 2009, from an address, a wallet address since 2009.
That's pretty big. That's amazing. Yeah, I think that I basically with you on this, Scott. I mean, my concern is less about fiat money system as such that's administered by central banks than it is about the client relation between the central banks that administer the fiat money system on the one hand and these big private sector banks on the other. And this gets back to that matter of sort of how do we balance the modulatory and the allocative task, given that to do that requires some kind of a marriage of the public and the private sector. How do we get that relation right? And I'm quite convinced that whatever it would be to get it right, what we have now is not it. That the kind of client relation, basically the form that unavoidable public-private relation takes, is essentially a client relation between central banks and large private sector banks. And I don't think that that's sustainable. And I think that is itself what makes the fiat money system dysfunctional. I think a fiat money system that was administered, or that was part of a relation between central banks and smaller community banks and small businesses, might very well work quite well. But that when it's done by, in effect, what we have, here's an analogy. You go back to feudal times, and you basically there was always basically the people who ran a country were a bunch of big landlords, right? These kind of knight feudal lords, and whoever was the biggest landlord of them all got to be the king or the monarch, and then the others were just sort of lords that were sort of somewhat subsidiary to the big kahuna lord, and then everybody else was a peasant. And so basically everything was sort of run through a relationship between the big lord and then the slightly smaller lords, and that's what we called oligarchy. And if you think of the big banks today as being analogous to the old feudal lords, and then think of the central bank as the big kahuna lord, financially we have something kind of like that feudal arrangement. The rest of us are peasants, and then you've got these big oligarchical banks, and then the big kahuna bank, which is the central bank. Now imagine a slightly different arrangement where, let's say that the big kahuna lord is actually democratically selected, right? It's not a king, but it's somebody who's actually fairly elected by a democratic process. And then that elected government then has a relation with all of the peasants, so to speak, all of us as individuals. And so now instead of peasants, we're all entrepreneurs, and we're all individuals, and we're citizens of a republic instead of peasants within a feudal oligarchy. Then it seems to me some sort of a relation between private and public sector would be fine, because the public sector would be us in the form of one collective agent that we've chosen to put in charge of collective affairs like the military and policing and basically running the money system in an intelligent way in the name of all of us. But we're so far away from that right now. I think of this as like if we had a monetary republic. This is a phrase I sometimes use in this connection. We currently have a monetary oligarchy. And that doesn't make sense, because our founders were trying to throw off oligarchy and monarchy. And, we still, in the Pledge of Allegiance to this day, say, and to the republic for which it stands. The idea of a republic meant something to our founders. It still means something to us, politically speaking. But oddly enough, we don't think about republics and what a republic is in connection with finance and money. But if we thought of ourselves as basically having to be a monetary republic in the same way that we are a political republic, then I think we could get money right. And I think in a sense, you and I are basically, this is, I think, what you and I are thinking through these days. What we're sort of, in a sense, engaged in is in a grand project of rethinking our monetary arrangements in such a way as to figure out how to turn this into a monetary republic rather than a monetary oligarchy. And I think we're going to get there. I think, you and I think, and our friends and associates, I think are sort of well motivated enough and sincere enough and informed and smart enough that I think we're going to figure it out. But I think I think we're getting close. You know, I think
So,
it's there.
so Bob, with you have had a background with the IMF. You've
Hmm.
got a background with the regulators now. And so one thing that I haven't asked, I don't think I asked you about this last week, but what what are your feelings, or your, what do you think is going to be happening with Judy Shelton's nomination? And she, in the crypto world, I'll just let you know that from everything that I've heard from the people that I'm learning about stuff from,
Hmm.
the crypto world is very pro Judy Shelton.
Hmm. Hmm.
Whether it, and I'm not sure how educated crypto she is, but I do have a good feeling that she is pro gold standard again, maybe.
Hmm.
So what are your thoughts? Do you think she's going to get, how do you feel about her, number one, and do you feel like that she does have a shot at getting approved once her nomination is allowed to go through? And I didn't really understand a couple weeks ago when they decided to delay it,
Hmm.
but do you think that she's sane, and do you think that she's got a shot at getting approved?
Yeah, so, I'm not. I'll say, just to be really quite frank, I'm sort of, I'm really kind of wondering about. It's hard for me to kind of assign probabilities at this point for a couple reasons. The first is that Mr. Trump, first floated a number of nominations that were kind of clearly frivolous, and in consequence, I think a lot of people who normally might not have been suspicious of whoever he might name are sort of a little more vigilant and on the lookout now than they would otherwise have been. So that means that she's going to come under closer scrutiny than she might have been if he had nominated her at the outset. So, like, for example, when he named Powell at the very beginning of his administration, that was uniformly praised, that appointment. Republicans and Democrats alike, everybody seemed to think this was actually a pretty smart appointment. And, in retrospect, I think most of them still agree, right? That Powell seems to be a level-headed, sane guy. But then when he started talking about, Stephen Miller or not Stephen Miller, what am I thinking? I forgot the name, momentarily forgetting the Irish name. Anyway, the first several names that he floated after Powell were sort of so clearly frivolous that I think a lot of, and so clearly crony-ish, that I think that aroused suspicions from people. So I think she's going to get more scrutiny. That's one thing. A second factor, I think, is that I think there's a little concern now that she might be kind of opportunistic or wishy-washy, because on the one hand, as you know, she's on record in the past as being, talking about bringing back some kind of a gold standard. But she's also very much now saying that, well, now she doesn't think that. And a lot of people think that's because she knows that's not going to fly in Congress. And so she's saying, well, I don't really think there should be a gold standard. Sort of similarly, she used to complain all the time that the Fed had too loose a monetary policy and that it should be much tighter. But then when Trump began to attack Powell for not being loose enough with monetary policy, all of a sudden she starts attacking Powell for not being loose enough, even though in the past she had been saying he's too loose. So I think there's some concern that there might be a kind of a John Kerry problem here, that there's a for it before I was against it problem, a kind of waffling. Now, I don't know, how fair that is, given that this is sort of a common coin of the realm, no pun intended, to sort of change positions opportunistically when you're looking for jobs these days. But it does seem to be something of a problem, at least as far as the politics go, because I know that a lot of people are sort of questioning her credibility on that basis, including some Republicans, like I think Rand Paul, for example, was concerned about the sort of waffling. So it's really hard for me to figure where it's likely to go from here. I just don't know. As for what I myself feel about her, I don't know. It's hard to know at the moment, because I haven't really been thinking about who ought to be appointed. We do still have these other seats to fill. But I've been so sort of preoccupied, I guess, with just how incompetent so much of the pandemic response has been at various points. I sort of lost. It's almost like I'm thinking, boy, I long for the luxury of inserting myself with Fed appointments again. I hope that it will that our most important question will once again soon be, who will the next Fed appointment be? But
Well, Bob,
I'm just praying that we're going to still have a CDC.
yeah. Well, Bob, I'm more fed up with the incompetence that allowed us to get to 40. What is it? What's the left side on the U.S. debt clock? Are we 42 trillion in debt? And then 24.
I think it's 24. Yeah.
Okay. 24 on the left and 147 in unfunded liabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Those and that we've allowed the derivative debt on the high side to be 1.2 quadrillion. I'm so
mind blowing, isn't it?
I'm just bewildered by that. Yeah. I can't even get really to be able to seriously think about things like Judy Shelton, but I'm forcing myself so people can have more to listen to than me just being befuddled.
Yeah, and this is itself, by the way, a product of that. Again, the particular client relation that we have here between the Fed and the big banks, right? All of those unfunded liabilities and all of that, all those sort of mega pseudo assets. That's all stuff that's generated by these large Wall Street institutions. And again, I mean, it'd be one thing if all of that stuff was small business debt that the Fed was holding on the books, because then at least we could sort of think, well, it might have something to do with actual productive activity that might at some point produce real goods and services that can then absorb the money. But what's really scary when this kind of stuff is associated with these kinds of liabilities on the balance sheet are associated with great big banking institutions is that, again, in most of these cases, there aren't hard assets backing it up, which is another way of saying there's no goods and services that we can associate with it that can then act to kind of absorb the money later, right? So, in general, debt is fine if it's being used to finance actual production. That's sort of what school debt is. Like if somebody borrows to go to college, the theory is that you're basically accumulating more human capital by going to school. And so you're basically developing the means of liquidating your own debt once you graduate, because you're going to earn a lot of money, you're going to produce wealth and so forth. And if you sort of extrapolate from that, if the economy is producing lots more in the way of accumulating wealth, in association with the additional debt that's taken on, then again, you're producing the means of liquidating the debt itself, and that's always healthy. That's fine. That's sort of what debt is for. But what's always scary is when the debt is accumulated simply to speculate on secondary markets or tertiary markets, basically on derivatives and the like. And that's generally what happens. That's what that money is spent on, or what that debt is used for when it's used by these big financial institutions. And that's exactly why we end up getting these sort of hyperinflationary episodes, if not in the goods and services markets, then in the asset markets. I'm sure you had the same thought. How many times have you heard people refer to the period from basically 1980 till about 2010 as the great moderation with low inflation? But that's always comical, because you can only say that with a straight face if you pretend that an asset price bubble in the financial markets is not a hyperinflation. If you're only looking at the price of bread and you say that bread didn't hyperinflate between 1980 and 2010, sure, that sounds like a great moderation. But why would you do that? Why would you blink yourself and only look at bread? If you look just across the way over at the financial markets, and you look at the prices of the financial assets and where they went over that 30-year period, that wasn't even an inflation. That was a hyperinflation. And that's the kind of thing that happens. That's the making of a crash down the road. And as you noted, right, we've basically been doing the same thing all over again in the interval. I mean, Dodd-Frank hardly did any good at all. I don't think Mr. Obama, God bless him, I think he meant well, but I just don't think he knew what he was doing when it came to fixing the financial system. And I think it's largely because he surrounded himself by the same people that Clinton had surrounded himself with. Rubin comes back, not Rubin exactly, but Summers and these others.
Summers.
So, they basically just proceeded immediately to sort of recreating the economy of the 90s in a certain sense. And, again, that looks good temporarily. It's fine on paper for a while, but that's because underneath you're basically ignoring all the termites who are eating away at the foundation.
Right. And, and again, I'm as a layperson, not as an economist, but I'm telling you, I understand how important confidence is to the system. I get
Yeah.
it.
Yeah,
That's the whole ball game.
it is.
And I understand when Mr. Powell on Sunday said what he said, and I understand when Steve Mnuchin says what he says,
Mm-hmm.
and I understand when Mr. Kudlow says what they say,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't believe them.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't see how they say that stuff with a straight face, because I'm looking back and I'm seeing what they did to Brooksley Bourne. They knew that there was a problem, and they fired the lady. And
Yep.
then in 2008, 2009, they put a Band-Aid on things. They didn't straighten out this derivative thing. They just allowed it to balloon up.
Completely.
And I understand. I mean, I'm looking at my television. I read today on Twitter 38% drop in GDP likely in 2020.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my television. The Dow is up 369 points. I mean, now, hey, I told you I'm not Ivy League. Appalachian is not Harvard, not Cornell. I'm not a rocket Scientologist.
Yeah. But we're up in the Adirondacks here. We're basically northern Appalachia here. So you and I probably share a mindset here.
But academically, you're top shelf, and I'm just. So, and Appalachian's a great school, but it's not the academic upper crust like the Ivy League. But I'm just trying to say I'm just an average. But if the average person just looked at this stuff, they wouldn't have any confidence in what's going on, because again, how are we going to overcome $147 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities? I mean, when 38% of GDP is going down and the stock market's going up, I mean, something is terribly wrong here.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely something kind of upside down about that. I suppose it probably tells you something also about just like another indicator, I guess, of just how bad things are, is that oftentimes the level that the market reaches at the end of the day is a function not only of where it looks like things are going, but where it was feared things might be going instead. So the market is basically viewing what's come out today as good news relative to what was thought to be possible. Right. And that tells you in turn something then about what was thought to be possible. Because if this is the good news, then imagine what the bad news would have been. Right. So so I think you're right.
So one of the things too that I was encouraged when you had brought up Bank of England, because Mark Carney and Bank of England is another Ripple partner. And when you listen to the lingo, and it's again part of the Kool-Aid drinking that goes on. I mean, I'm a believer in what Ripple and XRP is setting out to do. I believe in the use case and the problem they're trying to solve. I believe in what they're trying to do. They've got the technology to do it. They've got the use case proving it with MoneyGram. I get it.
Yeah.
But the lingo that has been going around, level the playing field.
Yeah.
Trump says it. Christine Lagarde says it. Mark Carney says it. And that's why I feel like maybe that we're all headed towards that reset, that debt jubilee, and then we're going to move into a digital currency that's going to level the playing field and bring in the underbanked up to a higher level, bring in the unbanked. We got one central currency, because I don't think, I'm sure you're familiar with BRICS.
Yep.
Brazil and Russia, India or Indonesia, China. I don't believe that they like having to trade at a deficit in currency with us.
Yeah. That reminds me, by the way, Scott, one thing we might talk about next time that we're on is as you might know, India in the last few years has put in place a really amazingly first-rate digital system.
Yep.
That seems to be doing absolute wonders. And one of my closer colleagues here at Cornell, a guy I work with a lot and do a lot of co-authoring even with, was for a while the chief economist at the Reserve Bank of India. And he played he played some role in making the initial decisions that led to the putting of that system in place. And he's a totally first-rate mind and a serious, I think, public servant, both in India and here in the States. He's back here at Cornell now. He just took a leave of absence to go over there because he was born in India. But we might want to. I'm getting increasingly intrigued by that system, which seems to be working wonders, and seems to be working in the micro lending space, which is so important in India as well. So we might want to do a little investigating between the two of us and then kind of compare notes on that.
Okay.
Good topic.
Yeah, I will find out because I do recall seeing an article or a number, and I'll do some research and find out so we can talk about it next time. But I think it was like 70% of the banks in India are RippleNet enabled. Yeah,
that makes sense because this system is itself a very Ripple interoperable system.
Yep.
So we might find, and again, it's when you're talking about a country of over 1 billion people who until recently weren't even really weren't integrated into the global economy or even into a unified national economy for that matter.
Right.
If this system is working to sort of rectify that there, then it would seem that its capacity to do something worthwhile here with a population of 330 million people might just sort of stand to reason.
Yep.
So we could do that.
I would love to do that. I would love to be able, since you've got such a good connection with someone involved so closely with India, that would be great.
Yeah. In fact, he's over there now visiting family. He was basically visiting family when the lockdowns were all sort of announced in March. So he's been kind of stuck there. And I'm sure he'd be thrilled to talk a little bit, basically just to have an opportunity to kind of
have a conversation about something besides just the same monotony of cabin fever. I get it.
Exactly. So I'll try to get an update from him and then I can report back to you on it. So. Okay,
that sounds great. All right, well, we'll go ahead and then wrap up, I guess, for today. And then I'd love to be able to talk again sometime next week if you're open for that. You froze up.
So I was saying it works for me, my friend. I'm pretty free next week as well. So let's plan on it.
Okay, good. All right, that sounds good. Listen, Bob, you take care. I'll do some India information to find out everything I can from the Ripple and XRP end about what we think's going on in India, and then you can find out the truth.
Or maybe we'll both get our own piece of the truth. We'll be like the lineman and the elephant. That's great. Yeah, and maybe then your listeners or your viewers might actually get some nice info out of this too.
That sounds fantastic. All right,
great, my friend. Okay, stay safe, stay well.
Take care. You too. Take care, my friend.
All righty. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.